This is Karen Johnson, and this is another one in a series of the Proctors History Committee tapings. The date today is October 27th, 2014, and we welcome you and have as our guest today Don Stracher, who is an architect from Schenectady and has been involved with Proctors for many, many years. Don, your firm has probably been the principal architect of everything we've done at Proctors. So tell us a little bit about how you first got involved.
Well, I want to say that we had the good fortune to get involved with Proctors. I believe it was about 1977. And I believe we were contacted by, I think it was the first executive director, Dennis Madden.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember why he contacted us. Maybe it's because we were local and close by. Contacted us and said he was getting involved with the theater and felt that he needed an architecture firm or an architect that he could occasionally bounce things off of and get involved with the theater for things that might be coming up. And I remember one of the first things he needed was, interestingly enough, was for the snack bar. He needed a counter design for the snack bar. And so we designed that, and a local millwork firm built that. That was probably one of the first things we did at the theater. And I remember Dennis telling us that you were talking about problems with the theater. He was down in the catacombs underneath the theater and dealing with a broken sewage pipe and, you know, the problems that occurred in those early years because they had, I think, suddenly took it over. The public group suddenly took the theater over, and there were just so many things to deal with. You know, it was absolutely amazing. And he just kept at it, kept going, got that solved, and on to the next problem.
Well, of which there were many. And just
there were many problems, yeah.
Just to put this in context, in 1977, the city took over the ownership of the theater.
Right.
And in '79, ACTS, Art Center and Theater. So Dennis was involved as a board member and then later as the executive director. And certainly in '79, we're very fortunate that we have on tape Dennis's firsthand account of how the sewer got just let loose on him and also flowing down down the aisles.
He was a good sport.
Well, you can say that again. So you were involved with the firm of, at that time, what was the name?
Our firm then was Stracher Roth.
And you were on J Street?
Myself and Mike Roth as my partner in those years. Yeah.
I recall that you have the original drawings of the theater, or a facsimile of them?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Actually, when we got started, there really were no drawings of the theater. We had nothing, and somehow we were able to contact. I remember a man who had worked for Thomas Lamb, and he had worked in New York. Had sort of taken over his office, Lamb's office. I don't remember how we got in contact with him, but somehow we did. And he said that he had closed the office. Well, everything had been turned by Lamb over to him, and he turned them over to the Avery Library at Columbia University. So I brought that to the attention of people here. I think Bob Warlock, I think, was here already, and others. And a group of them went down to the library and checked the things out, and sure enough, all the tracings were there. And I think we're about to have them reproduced when they found in the catacombs here under the theater some wood boxes with old prints. So I don't know if we ever had anything copied from those tracings, but we knew where they were, and they were in safekeeping.
So Thomas Lamb was the original designer.
He was the original designer who had done, I guess, as my understanding, research I did, is well over 300 theaters, and this was 300 something that he had done, because he had already done many theaters, and so this wasn't the first experiment. You know, he was pretty well versed at this point.
So you had the plans now, so you understood the theater.
Yeah, and they were very fascinating because looking at those plans, you could see in the lower levels where You know, there's a creek with many tributaries that runs around all around the downtown here, called the Cowhorn Creek, and a good portion of that ran under the theater here, and it was so clever the way Lamb and his people had designed to to take care of the fact that all this water was running in underneath the theater. They had the brick arches and other facilities they provided under the theater to make sure that wouldn't be a problem.
And it was just integrated right into the design?
It was just integrated right into the design. Of course, you can't see it in the public part of the theaters, but it is underneath in the structural part of the theater. And it was very fascinating. We did run into some problems much later on with that fact, which had to do with some settlement that took place. And then we brought in a soils engineer who analyzed it, and we found that there had been some organic material down there in the old creek bed that probably shrunk, and some things went with it, settled with it. But it turned out to be not a major problem.
And it is still there,
It's
even
still
after
there.
the
It's still all
renovations.
there. It's still all there, yeah.
Now, I've heard that the theater has like 2 structural elements, and that the top part of the theater is on a different structure from the floor. Maybe this is not correct.
That could be. I'm not that familiar with that.
Okay.
In all my years, I would say, just in terms of years, I probably spent over 30 years here. Starting in '77 and all the way up to, I kind of joke about it. 2021, I was Volunteer of the Year, and then it's like toodaloo, you know.
Well, you retired about that time.
Yeah, I retired at that time. Yeah.
And the theater is still using the firm, which is now Stracher, Roth, Gilmore.
Well, actually, Frank came into the practice in 1985, and so I started here in '77. And when I retired, Harry Upkarian, a wonderful executive director here, called me and said, "We're going to continue on with your firm," which was very nice. Really appreciated that. So they got to do the stage expansion and all the things that happened beyond that.
True. But you also, during this whole period, were on a board committee called the Facilities Committee.
Facilities Committee for several decades.
Now, I'm going to mention some things that I remember that were issues. Do you remember when we had some rock and roll stuff here?
Yes, I do.
And there was a noticeable movement in the balcony?
The balcony was vibrating, right.
What do you know about that?
Well, no, I remember that clearly, and I suggested a structural engineer who I knew for that, a local structural engineer who's now deceased, but John Percy, I thought was just the best structural engineer that I knew of, and he taught at RPI. And when you went into his office to do any project, he always had his blackboard and his formulas and everything else. He was really superb. And I think he eventually analyzed that and found that it was not a major problem, although I remember he did make some suggestions, I think, which had to do mostly with checking some connections and things just to make sure everything was okay. And I believe all that was done and everything turned out okay, because a certain amount of vibration is acceptable. You know, it can get beyond that point and then you have a problem. But I think with the level that was happening, it was okay. But, you know, important to check it out.
So do you remember other projects that you got involved with?
Well, you remember when this became Canal Square?
Oh, yes.
And there was a canal running around with pedal boats.
Briefly with paddle boats.
That you pay for to pedal around in the boat. And yeah, that was, and there was a bridge that was crossing over a part of the canal that was on the east end. That was very interesting and always had to be dealt with in one way or another. In fact, the design of the canal affected where our restrooms were, the men's and ladies' restrooms on the first level. And there was, I believe, an exchange of land there. And the theater restrooms, even though this is historic, the theater restrooms had to be demolished. And part of my job was to design new restrooms for the theater. And the restrooms that had been there was a men's smoking room, which was common in those days and not so common today. And just very, very interesting phenomenon to have to deal with, and to add facilities because they were really inadequate for today's use and the number of patrons in the theater. So that was expanded, and I had suggested at the time that we provide a concealed opening out into what was part of the canal area, because I figured things were going to change. Things are always changing. Cities are dynamic, and I believe later on they did use that opening to expand, I think, into the new boiler room and the boiler area of the theater. So it's like trying to anticipate what's going to happen, and trying to plan for that in a way that you're not wasting a lot of money.
Yeah, Don, I remember that you were pretty frugal on the behalf of Proctors about.
I tried to be. I guess it's the way I am in my own life, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I thought it was important for the theater because being on the facilities committee, I was very aware there was never enough funding,
For all
always a search for more money, for more funding. It's an expensive thing to operate, and yet it's such a worthwhile cause. It's a worthwhile thing.
I remember going to the opening of the restrooms, and they had a regular ribbon cutting. It was the first time I think I've ever seen a ribbon cutting for toilets.
That's right.
But it was a very welcome addition.
It was essential. It was essential.
And you used a lot of the material that were the marble and so forth.
Yeah, we reused. We took down the stalls, which were marble, beautiful. You know, what we did back in the days of Lamb, with all real marble, and even the doors were very nice millwork wood, and just reuse all that.
And there were enough of them around you could recover?
There were enough, and we actually added some, but we did them in marble. Proctors had the good attitude and foresight to say, well, yeah, okay, we agree with that. Let's not have some metal and some marble. You know, this historic theater, let's do it nicely. So they did that.
So by the time they took the bridges down,
yeah,
were you still working on the
we
theater?
on that side of the theater there was I think it's still there. There are fire escapes, metal fire escapes there that went all the way up and down, which you'd use out of the exits that are there.
Yes.
And one of our projects was to check the safety, of the fire escapes because they were quite old. So we checked every piece of metal, every joint, everything on those, and actually took care of a lot of problems with the fire escape. That related to that whole area of the bridges, and we designed a little courtyard area there. But eventually the bridges was removed anyway. The whole canal was abandoned and filled in.
You made in what's now the hotel parking lot, you made a nice little standing area there at one time, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
That people could come out of the theater and be outdoors.
That's right.
At that time,
that same
smoking.
area where the fire escapes are and the bridge was. Right. And then that changed after that. Once the bridge was gone, once all that was gone, then it was redone again. And that's common. That's what happens.
Well, it's funny because when we think of Proctors being a historic theater, we think maybe things are all the same as they were, but
no, they're not at all. In fact, I want to mention like the marquees on the front and back, because one of our things was to find out what the marquees had been, because the marquee that we confronted was a sort of a pie-shaped marquee that was on there probably since the 50s, 1950s. And we did have some old photos of things. And gradually, as we got the drawings, and we recreated the marquees as they had been.
In the Lamb drawings?
Yeah, we recreated the marquees front and back. They were constructed by the best sign people that we knew, which was local, which was Olson Sign Company. I don't know if you knew old Mr. Olson when he was around.
I know young Mr. Olson.
Well, he was an aficionado of antiques, and
Okay.
he had bought the Glenn Sanders mansion at one time, and because he loved it because it was like a big antique. In fact, he had invited myself and one of my partners to his home for a meal, and he was living with antiques. You know, he had Paul Revere. I mean, he had the real stuff. He was very authentic, and his two sons took over the business, and they built the marquee, both marquees. And I remember we had I think Mayor Ducey, I think, was the mayor at that time, and we had a ribbon cutting for that, and the rotating lights were turned on.
Oh, the
We
sky
had,
things?
yeah, outside was the switch, you know, as part of the ceremony. Flipped the switch, the lights were going, and it was very exciting. There were people all over the street, you know, just said, wow, look at that, you know, just it was fantastic.
Just for information, in 2014, we also had a switch when we rededicated the
Right.
because over time the water had gotten in it, and
it was
needed,
time to redo it. Yeah.
and so it was redone.
Right.
Just it looks virtually the same,
Yeah. Yeah.
except for the fresh coat of paint,
Right.
LED lamps,
Yeah. Which
and
is a
also
later version and less costly to operate and longer lasting. You know.
and then the little I don't know what we call them, computerized panels that
Right,
you
right.
can.
Yeah.
So
instead of changing all the letters and
So we did that during the daytime, so we didn't have the big
And
lights.
who knows what will happen next? Because things are always advancing. You know, advance. In fact, we had restored the front facade of the building too. That was pretty worn. It was cement plaster, and it was pretty worn, and there were some decorative elements that were really either gone or well worn. And I remember we had a wood carver make molds of what they were, and then they were reproduced in plaster. Yeah, and refinished in gold leaf and whatever.
Those are on the outside of the building?
That was on the outside front facing State Street. Yeah.
Because I'm hearing that we need to do that job again
Could
pretty
be.
soon.
It's a lot of years. I've been around that long, you know.
That's
Yeah, it's
interesting.
pretty amazing. And on the rear, see, there used to be stores at what is now Stratton Plaza, and we were asked to look at that because the old beautiful copper frames that the old storefronts had were either parts were gone or parts were worn, and we looked into how that was done. They used to have molds that they used to use to make those. It wasn't like what they call breaking the metal, just bending the metal. They used to actually form it, like melt the copper and use these molds to form the shapes.
Right on the glass?
And pardon?
Was it right on the glass they did that?
No. This is just the frame that holds the glass.
Okay.
The perimeter frames, and we found that those molds were long melted down. They were gone. Nobody did that anymore because nobody would spend the kind of money that you would need in today's world to do that. Back in those days, when you had more craftspeople, more skilled people, you could do it. But so we designed using the break approach,
Which is
parts that were as
bending.
close as we could get. Yeah, bending as close as we could get to what they were. But copper, we used copper, and we did, and the state historic people accepted that. Because they were always, you know, this being a historic theater, you always had to go through the state historic office in order to get approval.
And as long as you had that paper that said they approved, you could go ahead.
That's it. Yeah, you always had to submit that, and once you got the approval, you were okay. Yeah, and we had a good reputation with them, and they were good to us. I mean, we
Yeah.
didn't try to get away with anything because we would love to have it as authentic as we could have it. You know, as close as we could come to the original, that's what we really wanted to do.
It's interesting because one day one of these gentlemen was over here and he said, "You have such a beautiful theater. We don't worry about you too much because why would you want to do anything to harm it?"
That's right.
And I
That's
think
right.
that's really been the philosophy.
Yeah, if you could say, well, I can do something better than that, but we didn't know of anything better that we could do. It was so beautifully done. Another thing was the stained glass ceiling in the arcade. You're asking about projects. That was all painted over, and it was capped